The truck's engine coughed one last time before going silent, leaving only the crackle of its cooling hood in the darkness. Its massive frame loomed across my driveway like a barricade, sealing me in as though the asphalt itself had been seized by foreign powers. And there she was, Karen, standing in the glare of my porch light, arms crossed, eyes glinting with the smug triumph of someone who thought she'd just won the war. I froze in the doorway, my keys still in hand. For a second I thought maybe this was a misunderstanding, but when I called out, "Excuse me, you're blocking my driveway," she didn't flinch. She just tilted her head, lips curling upward into that smirk I'd come to know too well, the kind that said, "What are you going to do about it?" You ever have that moment where you realize someone isn't just being petty, they're daring you to fight them? That was Karen. She didn't just block my driveway, she staged it. This was a performance, and I was the unwilling audience. Here's the thing, though. That wasn't the beginning. That was the boiling point. And if you want to understand why this single truck set off the chain of events that followed, you need to come with me just a few weeks earlier, back when Pleasant Oaks still looked like a picture-perfect suburban postcard. 3 weeks earlier, the air had that crisp edge of early spring. Lawns hummed with mowers, the faint smell of fertilizer clung to the sidewalks, and kids coasted past on their bikes, trailing laughter behind them. On the surface, it was the kind of neighborhood you'd see in a real estate brochure. But under that freshly trimmed hedging, there was rot. Not literal rot. No, Karen would never allow that. I mean the kind of rot you can't see, but feel, like a smile stretched too tight. Karen had been HOA president for 5 years, and in those 5 years, she transformed our homeowners association from a simple volunteer committee into what felt like her private regime. Every rule was interpreted through her lens, every fine delivered with her flourish. You'd think she was running a federal agency instead of a cluster of cul-de-sac homes built in the mid-90s. The first time I tangled with her, it was over my trash bins. I'd left them by the curb overnight, a rookie mistake after moving in. By sunrise, a neon pink violation slip was taped to my garage door. Trash receptacles may not remain visible past 8 p.m. Her handwriting looped across the page like an accusation. I laughed at first, thought it was overkill. But then the fines stacked up. $50 here for improper mailbox color. $75 for grass exceeding 2.5 inches. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was inventing them. And she never missed a chance to deliver those violations in person, clipboard in hand like a badge of office. I'll never forget one particular Saturday morning. I was pruning my oak tree when she marched over, sunglasses reflecting the branches above. "That tree," she said, "cast shade across the sidewalk. It could obscure visibility for pedestrians." "Shade," I repeated, pruning shears dangling in my hand. "It's a tree. That's what they do." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's a liability. The HOA will be issuing a fine." It was like arguing with a brick wall that fined you for standing too close to it. The neighbors noticed too, but most stayed quiet. Karen had a way of making examples out of anyone who challenged her. She once had a family repaint their entire house because the beige was too warm. Too warm. Who even measures warmth in paint? Yet they did it, because fighting her was more exhausting than surrendering. But I wasn't wired that way. Each fine, each warning letter, each smug encounter, it all started to stack up. By the time the moving truck rolled across my driveway, I wasn't just irritated, I was primed. That night, as I stood under the porch light staring at her, I could feel the heat rising in my chest. "Move the truck," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She tilted her head again, that trademark Karen maneuver. "The street belongs to the HOA, and as HOA president, I've authorized temporary parking." Her words echoed, bouncing around in my skull. Temporary parking. as if she could wave her hand and decree where vehicles belonged, even if it meant blocking a resident's only access to their property. And she wasn't bluffing. HOAs do have certain rights over shared roadways, especially if they're considered private streets maintained by the association. But what she didn't mention, what she either overlooked or thought I didn't know, was that our street wasn't entirely hers to command. Still, in that moment, legal nuance didn't matter. What mattered was the neighbors peeking through blinds, watching the spectacle. What mattered was Karen standing there, radiating smugness like a lighthouse of condescension. "Karen," I said, trying to steady my voice, "you can't block my driveway." "Oh, I can," she said, "and I have." There are confrontations that end in shouting, and there are confrontations that end in silence, heavy enough to crush you. This one was both. I clenched my jaw, turned, and went back inside, but not before catching the faint sound of her chuckle as she walked away. That chuckle wasn't just mockery. It was a declaration. Inside, I paced the living room. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, a maddening metronome to my thoughts. My car sat useless behind the wall of metal in the driveway, my plans for the evening canceled by one woman's petty display of power. I opened my laptop, pulled up the HOA bylaws, and scrolled, page after page of fine print, clauses about landscaping, exterior modifications, noise restrictions. It was a labyrinth designed to confuse, but I wasn't reading casually anymore. I was searching for something. A crack, a seam, a way in. But before I found it, the night brought another twist. At around 10 p.m., I heard a knock at the door. 3 sharp raps. When I opened it, one of my neighbors, Linda, stood there clutching a folded piece of paper. She looked nervous, her eyes darting toward the street. "I thought you should see this," she whispered. She handed me the paper and left without another word. I unfolded it and felt my stomach twist. It was a notice, typed on HOA letterhead, announcing temporary driveway obstructions may be authorized for community needs. Signed at the bottom in that looping handwriting, Karen Mitchell, HOA president. Community needs. Blocking my driveway was apparently a service to the community. That was when I realized this wasn't just about me. Karen was testing boundaries, seeing how far she could push before someone broke. And I knew if I didn't push back, she'd keep going, not just with me, but with everyone. I stared at that paper under the dim glow of my desk lamp, the ink shimmering slightly where it had been pressed too hard into the page. It wasn't just a notice. It was a gauntlet thrown at my feet. And that night, as the moving truck sat silent in my driveway, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to fight her. I was going to beat her at her own game. But of course, Karen wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The letter was taped to my door before dawn, red ink across the top. Notice of violation. The words jumped at me like a flare, and I swear the ink almost bled into the wood grain. Beneath it, in neat looping cursive, Karen's handwriting scrawled the words, "Improper exterior ornamentation." And the ornament in question? A wind chime. A $3 wind chime I bought at the hardware store because I liked the sound of it on breezy nights. This wasn't about wind chimes. This was about control. And in Pleasant Oaks, control had one name, Karen. Picture it. Perfectly aligned hedges lining the sidewalks like soldiers, grass trimmed to regulation length, 2.5 inches, never more, never less. Driveways swept so clean you could eat dinner off the concrete. And cutting through all of it, like a warden making rounds in her prison block, was Karen. Clipboard in one hand, smartphone in the other, snapping photos for evidence. She didn't walk the neighborhood, she patrolled it. You might think I'm exaggerating, but let me ask you this. Have you ever heard of someone being fined because their patio chairs didn't match? No? Well, in Pleasant Oaks, the Johnsons across the street learned that lesson the hard way. Their mix of wrought iron and wicker apparently violated community aesthetic cohesion. Karen slapped them with a $150 fine and a written demand to replace every chair within 10 days. When they pushed back, citing the HOA's own guidelines, which mention nothing about patio furniture, she summoned them to a compliance hearing. I sat through that meeting out of morbid curiosity. It was held in the clubhouse, fluorescent lights buzzing, the smell of burnt coffee hanging in the air. Karen sat at the head of the folding table, papers neatly stacked in front of her, posture stiff as a judge. The Johnsons tried to argue their case, but Karen cut them off at every turn. "It's not about the letter of the rules," she said with a smile. "It's about the spirit of the community." Do you hear the arrogance in that? Not the letter of the rules, the spirit, which meant whatever she decided the spirit was that week. I should have known then. I should have realized what we were all up against. The mailbox saga drove the point home even harder. Our neighbor Carl, a retired firefighter, had painted his mailbox a shade of tan, a harmless, subtle tan. But Karen declared it was not approved beige number 7 as listed in the HOA's color palette. That cost him $75. He repainted. The new color was too warm, according to her. Another fine. Eventually, Carl just gave up and ordered an entirely new mailbox from the list Karen approved herself. That was how she broke people, not with huge punishments, but with a steady drip of nonsense until compliance felt like the only way to survive. Now, don't misunderstand me. HOAs do have a purpose. They keep property values in check, maintain common areas, enforce safety standards. I'd read enough of the bylaws to know Karen wasn't inventing the concept of enforcement. But she wasn't enforcing rules. She was weaponizing them, turning guidelines into ammunition and neighbors into enemies. And then she turned her sights on me. It started with the trash bin violation, sure, but after the oak tree incident, I could feel her circling. Every time I mowed the lawn, I'd catch her on the sidewalk, sunglasses on, phone raised as if documenting the exact blade height. Once, when I parked my car on the street overnight, I woke to find a warning stuck under my windshield wiper. Unauthorized street parking, subject to towing. Technically, she wasn't wrong. The HOA did have authority over on-street parking in our private development. But here's the kicker. Half the board routinely parked outside when their driveways filled with cars during family gatherings, and Karen never said a word to them. Selective enforcement, plain and simple. I wasn't the only one noticing. Linda from down the block told me she kept a shoebox full of her violation notices. One day, she whispered, "Someone's going to use all this against her." She said it like a prophecy, like she'd been waiting for the chosen neighbor to rise up and strike back. I didn't know it then, but I was about to become that neighbor. The escalation came at the May HOA meeting. I walked into the clubhouse, the musty smell of carpet cleaner stinging my nose, and found Karen already perched at the head of the table. She didn't even wait for roll call before she looked directly at me. "Mr. Daniels," she said, never my first name, always formal like she was announcing charges in a courtroom. "We need to address your wind chime violation." I glanced around the room. Half a dozen neighbors sat in folding chairs, their expressions blank, eyes darting anywhere but at me. Nobody wanted to be caught taking sides. "It's a wind chime," I said. "It doesn't violate any of the written guidelines." Karen smiled that smile, the one where her lips curved but her eyes stayed flat. "It violates the auditory harmony of the neighborhood." I laughed. Couldn't help it. Auditory harmony? That's not a rule. Her nails tapped against her clipboard. "It is now. I've submitted an amendment to the board, and once it passes, your violation will be retroactively valid." Retroactive. That word hung in the air like smoke. She was rewriting the rules, backdating them, and then using them as a hammer. "Is that even legal?" I asked, scanning the board members for support. They avoided my gaze, shifting uncomfortably. "Of course it is," Karen replied, voice honey smooth. "Our bylaws allow for amendments to protect community standards, and as president, I'm authorized to enforce them." That was the moment I felt the ground shift. She wasn't bluffing. HOAs really do have amendment powers, though typically they require board votes and sometimes community approval. But in Pleasant Oaks, the board was her rubber stamp, and the community too beaten down to resist. After the meeting, Linda caught me in the parking lot. The sodium lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh yellow circles across the pavement. "She's scared of you," she whispered. "That's why she's coming after you so hard." I frowned. "Scared of me? Why?" "Because you don't fold. Everyone else does. She needs you to fold, or she'll lose her grip." That idea stuck with me on the drive home. Was I really a threat to her, or was I just the next pawn in her game? Either way, I knew one thing. She wasn't going to stop until she broke me, and I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. The next morning, I woke to find a fresh letter slid under my door, another violation notice, this time for lawn edging not properly aligned with community standard. The paper trembled in my hand, not from fear, but from the sheer absurdity of it. Lawn edging? She was grasping at straws, or maybe testing how far she could push. You will not believe what she tried next. But that's the thing about people like Karen. They don't understand boundaries. The more you resist, the more desperate they get. And as I stood there with that violation notice in my hand, watching the sprinklers hiss across perfectly trimmed lawns, I realized Pleasant Oaks wasn't a neighborhood anymore. It was a prison, and Karen was the warden. But what happens when the prisoners stop playing by the warden's rules?
$500, I muttered, staring at the red block letters like they'd been carved in blood. Violation, excessive shade. My hand shook, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about power. Imagine it, a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning. Sunlight cutting across my living room floor, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, and there I stood, holding a letter that made reality feel like a parody. $500 because my oak tree dared to do what oak trees do, cast a shadow. You think I'm exaggerating? I wish I were. Karen had done it again. See, by this point, Karen had already nailed half the cul-de-sac with fines. Peeling mailbox paint, mismatched Christmas lights, garbage cans left out for more than 12 hours. She wielded those violations like a sword, swinging at anyone who stepped a toe out of line. But this? Shade? That was different. That was personal. 3 weeks earlier, the first warning had arrived. A bright yellow slip taped to my door. Notice of violation, tree encroachment. I laughed it off. The wording was vague, citing Section 7.3 of the Landscaping Guidelines, something about maintaining unobstructed pedestrian passage. My oak didn't block the sidewalk. It didn't even drop branches. It just stood there, strong, silent, casting shade the way it had for decades before I moved in. But then came the second notice, and the third, each one more pointed, each one with Karen's neat little signature at the bottom. And when I ran into her by the mailboxes one afternoon, she made sure I knew it wasn't a mistake. "Rules are rules," she said, tilting her head with that smug little smirk. "It's nothing personal, but trees must be managed, or else they become, well, problems." "Problems?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "Well," she said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret, "some homeowners prefer the sun. Too much shade can encourage mold on walkways and, well, let's just say the board takes safety very seriously." That's when I realized it. She wasn't protecting anyone. She was testing me. So when the fine finally arrived, the full $500 penalty, it felt like the opening shot of a war. And believe me, I wasn't about to lose. Now here's what you need to know. HOAs have procedures. Fines don't just magically appear. They start with a notice of violation, then a chance to cure the issue, then, if the board approves, a formal fine is imposed, and by law, homeowners have the right to appeal. It's all supposed to be fair, checks and balances. But in Pleasant Oaks, the process ran straight through Karen. She chaired the compliance committee, she signed off on the notices, and when the board met, she dominated every discussion, twisting the bylaws like a magician with a deck of cards. If she wanted you fined, you were fined. I wasn't about to play her game. That afternoon, I spread the HOA bylaws across my kitchen table, flipping through the dense pages like a lawyer prepping for trial. Section 7.3, the landscaping clause. I read it once, twice, 3 times. Nowhere did it mention shade. It only required trees to be trimmed so branches didn't block sidewalks or grow into neighboring lots. My oak tree did neither. In fact, I had receipts from an arborist just 2 months earlier, confirming it was in perfect condition and fully compliant. She thought I wouldn't check. She thought I'd roll over and pay. But instead, I gathered evidence. Photos of the sidewalk in broad daylight, measurements of the clearance height under every branch, a written statement from my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who'd lived next door for 20 years and never had an issue with that tree. And then came the moment of escalation. The HOA board held its monthly meeting in the clubhouse on a Thursday evening. I showed up with my binder full of evidence. Karen sat at the head of the table, gavel in hand, her clipboard stacked with papers. The other board members, 3 of them, tired-looking volunteers, shifted uncomfortably in their seats as I took the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to appeal an unjust fine issued against my property. Karen interrupted immediately. The fine was issued according to procedure. The tree casts excessive shade, which creates a hazard. The matter is closed. Closed? I shot back. According to Section 7.3, the only violations are overhanging branches or obstructed passage. My tree has neither. In fact, I have receipts from an arborist just 2 months earlier, confirming it was in perfect condition and fully compliant. I slapped the photo onto the table, the sound echoing through the room. Here's a time-stamped photo of the sidewalk at noon. Clear, walkable, no hazard. The board members leaned forward, studying the evidence. One of them, Mr. Lewis, rubbed his chin. It does seem compliant. Karen's jaw tightened. Shade contributes to mildew growth. We've had complaints. From who? I cut in, because Mrs. Henderson here is happy to testify that she's never had a single issue with that tree. And if mildew is really the concern, then perhaps the board should revisit its maintenance policies instead of targeting one homeowner. For a moment, silence. The kind of silence where you can hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above. Karen tapped her gavel against the table. The board will deliberate privately. I left the room knowing 2 things. First, the fine would probably stick because Karen wouldn't let her pride take a hit. And second, she had just made a critical mistake. She revealed that her power wasn't absolute. It depended on the illusion of authority. And I was ready to strip that illusion bare. That night, as I walked home under the glow of street lamps, I could feel the neighborhood watching. Curtains twitching, porch lights flicking on. People knew what was happening, even if they didn't say it out loud. Karen had ruled unchecked for years, but now someone was standing up. And if I was right, others were waiting for a chance to do the same. The next morning, I received an email from the HOA secretary. The board has upheld the fine, payment due within 30 days. I laughed out loud, not because I was beaten, but because the game had officially begun. You see, Karen thought she'd won. She thought she'd buried me under bureaucracy. But in reality, she just handed me the rope she'd eventually hang herself with. Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the street she was so desperate to control didn't even belong to the HOA. It belonged to me. And soon enough, she was going to learn what it meant to pick the wrong fight. But before that, she was going to make one more move, One final desperate escalation that would turn this simmering feud into an all-out war. And believe me, you won't believe what she tried next.
She doesn't own the street. That was the line I whispered to myself at 2:13 a.m., the fluorescent bulb in my garage flickering like a bad interrogation scene. My hands were covered in dust from old folders, bylaws, and minutes of HOA meetings no one had looked at in years. And there it was, the clause, the overlooked sentence that changed everything. The truth was sharper than any fine Karen had ever issued. The streets of Pleasant Oaks were not HOA owned. They were city easements maintained by municipal funds, subject to public access. Meaning, Karen's kingdom didn't stretch as far as she thought. And if you're listening closely right now, you probably feel the same chill I felt. I had just found the first real crack in her armor. Let me rewind. You have to understand how I got to that garage, that late-night obsession, that moment of near madness. Karen had been escalating for weeks. First, it was the shade fine, then a notice that my driveway wasn't up to visual standards because of minor cracks. 2 hairline lines in the concrete, probably older than my mortgage. And of course, she slapped a 30-day deadline to repair or face another $250 penalty. By then, I was past anger, past frustration. I was calculating. If she could twist bylaws, then I could study them until they snapped back in her face. And that's exactly what I did. 3 weeks earlier, I had shown up at the HOA office, really just a small rented suite in the back of a bland office park, armed with a polite smile. "I'd like to see the full HOA charter and bylaws," I told the part-time admin, a college kid who looked like he'd rather be playing video games. Karen doesn't usually let people check those out," he said. I leaned in. "She doesn't have a choice. Under state law, all HOA governing documents must be available to homeowners upon request. I'll wait." He blinked, then shuffled off, returning with a dented cardboard box that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. That's when the hunt began. Now here's where things got interesting. You'd think HOA bylaws would be crisp, modern, typed up neatly, but no. Ours were a Frankenstein of amendments, handwritten notes from past boards, and copies so blurry they looked like ghosts. Every section referenced another. See Article 5.3c. Refer back to Section 12. It was a maze designed to confuse, and Karen had mastered it. But Karen made one mistake. She assumed no one else would ever go this deep. Back in my garage, I spread everything out on a folding table. Bylaws, plats, old city zoning maps I pulled from the clerk's office, and after nights of tracing references, I found Article 7.1, the clause. It was buried in a section about common area maintenance. The HOA had authority over landscaping, pool upkeep, and non-public easements. But there, in bold, was the exemption: all thoroughfares, roads, and cul-de-sacs within Pleasant Oaks are designated as public right-of-way, maintained by the city, not the association. That one line meant everything. Karen had been acting like she controlled parking, traffic flow, even driveway access, but in reality, she had no legal authority over the street itself. I could almost hear her voice in my head, screeching about how she approved which cars could park on the street overnight. I could see the smug tilt of her head as she ordered a neighbor to move a basketball hoop because it obstructed the roadway. She had been bluffing all along, weaponizing ignorance. And that's when it hit me. Her latest stunt, blocking my driveway with those ridiculous traffic cones, wasn't just petty, it was illegal. She was enforcing power she didn't even have. The next day, I decided to test the waters. At 9 a.m., with the sun glaring off freshly watered lawns, I walked out to the cul-de-sac where Karen was lecturing poor Mrs. Henderson about the shade of beige on her garage trim. "Morning, Karen," I said, holding a copy of Article 7.1 in my hand. She turned, lips already pursed. "You're out of compliance with your driveway. Have you scheduled repairs yet?" I ignored the jab. "Quick question. Who authorized the cones across my driveway last week?" Her eyes flickered, just for a second. "The HOA has authority over community traffic safety." Actually, I unfolded the paper like I was presenting evidence in court. Article 7.1 states otherwise. Streets are city property, which means you have no jurisdiction over driveways, parking, or so-called traffic safety. For the first time, she stuttered. "Well, those rules have always been enforced." "That doesn't make them legal." My voice carried louder than I intended, and I noticed 3 neighbors peeking through blinds. Karen's cheeks flushed pink, but she quickly regained her composure. "I'll review it," she said, spinning on her heel. But the damage was done. I saw the tremor of doubt in her posture. That confrontation didn't end the war, but it cracked the facade, and I could feel the neighborhood shifting. Later that evening, Mr. Patel stopped me by the mailbox. "You really told her off today," he whispered. "She's been bullying us for years. Keep pushing." And oh, I intended to, because if Article 7.1 was my sword, I was just learning how to swing it. Over the next week, I began to collect every violation notice Karen had ever issued about parking too close to the curb, every fine about street obstruction. I photocopied them all, lined them up against Article 7.1 like ammunition. She had been fining people illegally, and she hadn't even realized the paper trail she left behind could destroy her credibility. But here's the part that still gives me chills. While digging deeper, I found something else, something worse. In the meeting minutes from 5 years ago, there was a vote, never properly ratified, about repaving assessments. Karen had convinced the board at the time to collect street maintenance fees from homeowners, even though the city was already paying for it. Thousands of dollars collected under false pretenses. You hear me? She wasn't just petty, she was skimming money off rules she had no right to enforce. That discovery lit a fuse inside me. I wasn't just defending my driveway anymore. I was about to unravel her entire regime. But I knew I couldn't go public too fast. If I confronted her with everything at once, she'd rally her loyalists, spin it, bury me under counter-complaints. No, I needed precision, patience. So I sat there late at night, garage humming, notes spread around me like a conspiracy board. I circled Article 7.1 in red ink. I underlined the fraudulent fees, and I asked myself one question. How do you dethrone a self-crowned queen without warning her she's already lost? Because here's the thing, Karen wasn't going to back down quietly, and if she even suspected how close I was to exposing her, she'd unleash hell on me before I could make my move. I leaned back in that lawn chair, staring at the flickering light, listening to the crickets outside. For the first time, I wasn't scared of her anymore. I was planning her downfall. And yet, even then, I didn't know how far she was willing to go to protect her throne, or how quickly the neighborhood would turn into a battlefield once the first shot was fired.
"The street isn't yours, Karen." Those were the first words out of my mouth, steady but sharp as I stared her down beneath the sodium-orange streetlight. Her nephew's beat-up pickup sat at a crooked angle across my driveway, engine ticking, exhaust fogging the humid night air. She leaned on the hood like a queen, surveying her dominion. I swear her smirk was brighter than the headlights. And the worst part, she knew exactly what she was doing. Now let me back up. You've heard about her fines, her letters, her crusade against patio furniture that didn't harmonize. But this was different. This wasn't some typed notice slipped into a mailbox with a citation to Article 4, Section B. This was boots on the ground, a show of force. She wanted the neighborhood to see me kneel. And the neighborhood was watching. Curtains shifted in houses up and down the cul-de-sac. Porch lights flicked on like cautious eyes. I could feel every set of pupils trained on us,
waiting to see if I'd cave or combust. You ever have one of those moments where you realize someone has pushed you past paperwork, past procedure, straight into something primal? That was me right there in Pleasant Oaks, with Karen daring me to move her pawn off my driveway. 3 weeks earlier, the pattern had already started tightening up. She fined me for leaving my trash can visible for 43 minutes after pickup. 43, as if she had been clocking it with a stopwatch from her window. Then came the notice about noise violations when I used a power washer on a Saturday afternoon. The bylaws did allow for reasonable maintenance activities, a clause I knew by heart. But Karen's definition of reasonable was whatever suited her mood. When I appealed those fines, I showed up to the HOA hearing prepared. I had my documents, my photographs, even the time-stamped video of my trash can still on the curb at 9:13 a.m. I laid it all out, calm and factual. But Karen sat at the head of the folding table in the rec center, tapping her pen against her clipboard, making sure her allies on the board glanced at her before every vote. "Denied," she said like she was stamping a passport. "Fines stand." The room felt rigged, and maybe it was. You see, most homeowners never show up to hearings. They just write checks, grumble, and move on. But I wasn't built that way. That brings us back to that night, the night the truck blocked my driveway. I pulled out my phone and started recording, framing both her and the truck in the shot. I said, "This is a violation of Section 6.04 of the HOA bylaws. Driveways must remain unobstructed for emergency access." Her smile faltered for a flicker of a second, but she recovered fast. "My nephew is visiting," she said sweetly, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "He'll be here a short while. Nothing in the rules against family dropping by." She was right about that part. Guests weren't forbidden, but blocking a driveway? That was a different story. The rules were clear. No vehicle could impede ingress or egress of a homeowner's property, a clause designed for fire trucks and ambulances. She was playing chicken with public safety. "Move it," I said. Her nephew, a lanky 20-something in a baseball cap, shifted uncomfortably. Karen, maybe we should—" "Stay put," she snapped, not breaking eye contact with me. It wasn't about the truck. It was about control. That night, I didn't scream, I didn't curse, I simply dialed the non-emergency police line. My voice stayed calm as I reported a blocked driveway in a private subdivision. By the time the squad car rolled up, half the cul-de-sac had come out onto their porches with folded arms and coffee mugs, hungry for spectacle. The officer stepped out, shining his flashlight on the truck. "Who owns this vehicle?" Karen's nephew raised a hand. "Sir, you need to move it, now." Karen tried to interject, "Officer, this is an HOA matter, not police business." But the officer cut her off. "Blocking a residential driveway is a violation of city ordinance. Either he moves it or we tow." For once, Karen's clipboard couldn't shield her. Her nephew mumbled something under his breath, climbed into the truck, and pulled away, tires crunching over the asphalt. The sound was sweeter than a violin. The officer gave me a nod, took down the report, and drove off. And then it was just me, Karen, and the collective inhale of Pleasant Oaks watching from the shadows. "You'll regret this," she whispered, low enough that only I could hear. And there it was. The line had been crossed. No more fines on technicalities, no more passive-aggressive memos. Now she had threatened me directly. The days that followed were like living under siege. I'd find anonymous notes slipped under my doormat. "We're watching you." My mailbox door mysteriously bent out of shape. Twice my sprinkler heads were kicked sideways, flooding the lawn into a swampy mess. Could I prove it was her? Not yet. But the signature, the needling precision, felt like Karen all over. I started digging deeper. I requested copies of board meeting minutes under my right as a member. I highlighted inconsistencies in how fines were applied, how some board allies mysteriously never received citations for the same infractions others paid dearly for. I cataloged them in a binder, page after page. My garage looked less like storage and more like a war room. And Karen noticed. One evening, as I walked back from the mailbox, she intercepted me on the sidewalk, clipboard clutched like a weapon. "You're wasting your time," she said. "Nobody in this neighborhood cares about your paperwork." I stared back. "Then why are you so nervous about it?" Her lips tightened, but she didn't answer. The confrontation left me buzzing, adrenaline sparking in my veins. She wanted me rattled. Instead, she tipped her hand. If my paper trail didn't matter, she wouldn't have felt the need to confront me at all. That meant I was onto something. But here's the part that still chills me. The night after that conversation, I heard the unmistakable hiss of spray paint outside my garage door. By the time I flung it open, all I caught was the tail end of a figure retreating into the shadows. Red paint streaked across the siding in sloppy letters. "Traitor." Neighbors woke to the sight, whispering, pretending not to stare. No one saw anything, no one heard anything, at least that's what they told me. The HOA had rules about vandalism, rules about property damage, but who was in charge of enforcing them? Karen, and she had no intention of investigating. So I took pictures, I logged a police report, I patched the siding myself, but I left one small corner of paint untouched, a scar, a reminder. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about Karen enforcing rules. This was about her controlling the narrative, about punishing anyone who challenged her authority. And it left me with a question I couldn't shake. If she was willing to twist bylaws, weaponize fines, and turn neighbors into silent accomplices, what else was she willing to do? I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find out. Because Karen was only getting started.
According to the county registry, this road, Maple Bend Drive, does not belong to the HOA. It belongs to me. The words didn't just hang in the air, they detonated. Gasps, chairs scraping, a whispered, "Oh my God," from Mrs. Patterson in the second row. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed to buzz louder, as if the clubhouse itself understood the magnitude of what had just been said. And there was Karen, her lips curling into the start of a smug retort until she saw the document. That thick official paper, stamped and notarized, sliding across the table toward her like a blade. The color drained from her face. For the first time in months, maybe years, the self-proclaimed queen of our HOA didn't look untouchable. She looked cornered. Now let's rewind, because you're probably wondering, how does a homeowner end up holding the deed to a street? And more importantly, how did Karen, the woman who thrived on control, miss it? 3 weeks earlier, I was sitting in my garage, sweat beading on my forehead from the summer heat, stacks of HOA records scattered around me like the wreckage of a shipwreck. The hum of the old fridge was the only sound breaking the silence. That's when I found it. Buried in the original development plans, an easement agreement dating back nearly 2 decades. It was dry, cryptic legalese, but the meaning was clear enough if you read between the lines. The developer had retained ownership of the road pending private conveyance. And guess who'd purchased the developer's last remaining assets in a bulk sale at auction 2 years ago? Yours truly. At the time, it had been a fluke investment. Cheap parcels, odd scraps of property I thought might someday be useful. I never imagined one of those scraps would be the very asphalt Karen strutted across with her clipboard of power. Still, possession of paper wasn't enough. If I wanted this to hold up against Karen's inevitable denial, I needed proof. That meant county records. I spent days in the courthouse archives, the air thick with the smell of dust and ink, thumbing through deeds, easements, plat maps. Every document confirmed the same conclusion. The HOA maintained the road, but it didn't own it. And under local statutes, maintenance didn't equate to ownership. By the time I pieced it together, I wasn't just holding leverage, I was holding a nuclear option. But timing was everything. Karen gave me that timing herself. She pushed too far. It was the week before the emergency meeting when Karen dropped her latest letter in my mailbox. An official violation notice claiming I owed $1,000 in road usage assessments. Road usage, as though driving to my own house required a toll. You will not believe this, but she even cited wear and tear from heavier vehicles. My truck, my driveway, my road, though she didn't know it yet. I kept the letter, smoothed it out on my kitchen counter, and smiled. The trap was set. At the next board meeting, I stayed quiet. Let her feel safe. Let her think her grip was still absolute. She rattled off fines like rosary beads, cutting down anyone who dared speak out. Mr. Lee about his garden gnome, the Johnsons about their trash bins, me about my truck. Her smirk grew sharper with each ruling, as though she could sense victory piling up. But in reality, her empire was about to collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. Then came the emergency meeting. The clubhouse smelled faintly of burnt coffee and pine saw, the folding chairs creaking under the weight of restless neighbors. Karen sat at the head of the long folding table, clipboard in hand, pearls glinting under the fluorescent lights. Her nephew lounged by the door, his arms crossed like some low-rent bodyguard. The board members, 2 tired retirees and 1 sycophant, flanked her like stage props. "Next order of business," Karen announced, voice sharp as glass. "Unpaid assessments by Mr." She paused to savor the moment. "By our friend here." Her eyes locked on mine, daring me to flinch. I didn't. Instead, I rose slowly, a man carrying not just defiance, but evidence. My lawyer, seated in the back row, nodded once. Showtime. I placed the folder on the table, the slap of paper loud enough to hush the room. Karen rolled her eyes. "We're not here to waste time with theatrics." "Actually, you are. Because this isn't about theatrics. It's about ownership." The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read aloud. His voice echoed against the cinder block walls, formal and deliberate. "Deed number 2004-1178, recorded with the County Register of Deeds, transfers ownership of the parcel designated as Maple Bend Drive from Horizon Development to," he paused for effect and then looked directly at Karen, "to Mr." Gasps. The room shifted. A low murmur spread like a current. Mrs. Patterson clutched her pearls. Mr. Lee actually smiled. Karen's smirk faltered. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, snatching the paper. "The HOA owns the road. We've always owned the road." "Maintenance," I corrected, my voice calm, razor sharp. "According to Section 4, Subdivision Code 18.3, the HOA may be responsible for upkeep, but legal title, that's mine, which means your so-called usage fees are invalid." The board members shifted uncomfortably. One of them, old Mr. Greer, rubbed his temples like he was realizing just how deep in Karen's pocket he'd been. Karen tried again, her voice climbing. "This is nonsense. The HOA bylaws give us authority over all common areas. Except this isn't a common area. It's a private parcel under deeded ownership, my client's ownership. The bylaws don't override county law." And that was it. That was the crack in her armor. The neighbors smelled it too. A tide was turning in that room. People who had been silent for months, years, leaned forward, their eyes narrowing not at me, but at her. Karen sputtered, her face flushed crimson. "Well, then I'll challenge this. I'll take it to court." "Go ahead," I said softly, almost a whisper. "But until you do, remember this. Every step you take on this road, every fine you issue tied to it, every threat you make standing on it, you're standing on my property." The silence that followed wasn't silence at all. It was victory. It was the sound of power shifting, of an empire cracking. But don't think this was the end. Oh, no. Karen wasn't the type to surrender. She was the type to regroup, to plot, to claw her way back even when the walls were closing in. And as the meeting dissolved into chaos, neighbors buzzing, papers flying, Karen storming out with her nephew trailing behind, I felt it. The beginning of her unraveling. The first thread pulled. And yet, even as I walked home under the dim glow of the streetlights, my streetlights technically, I couldn't shake a single thought. If she was willing to go this far before, what would she do now that the ground beneath her heels was gone?
"Move the gate right now." Her voice cracked like glass under pressure, a shrill command that bounced off the quiet morning air. But the padlock clicked shut, final and unyielding, as I slid the chain through the latch and tugged once to make sure. Karen's silver Lexus sat trapped behind it, gleaming like a caged beast under the rising sun. For once she wasn't in control, I was. You could feel it in the air, that shift, That silence that wasn't really silence. Neighbors stood in their driveways pretending to water lawns, their eyes darting between us. A sprinkler sputtered to life, ticking against the pavement like a metronome for the standoff. Karen's manicured hand gripped the bars, her red nail squatching the paint. I almost laughed. Almost. Because what you're about to hear wasn't just about a gate. It was about precedent, about power, about using her own precious bylaws as a weapon against her. And believe me, you will not believe how perfectly it all lined up. 3 weeks earlier, the idea had started like a splinter in my brain. After the road ownership clause I unearthed, after the emergency meeting that left Karen pale and shaken, I knew she wouldn't stop. Queens don't abdicate quietly. They claw. They claw until there's nothing left. And sure enough, she clawed. Suddenly, my mailbox was being inspected for unauthorized modifications. A notice appeared taped to my door, citing my garbage can placement 2 inches over the approved boundary. She even tried to fine me for leaving holiday lights up beyond the 30-day grace period, even though it was February and the lights were long gone. It was petty, relentless harassment. But it also gave me an idea. See, HOAs love gates, love them. They put them up to control access, to preserve property values, to protect against liability. The irony? Karen herself had spent months campaigning for a decorative gate at the neighborhood entrance, only to lose the vote when homeowners balked at the price tag. I remembered her speech in the clubhouse, the way she lectured us on controlled egress points and improved uniformity. Her own words. I kept the minutes from that meeting, stored in a blue folder marked HOA Miscellaneous. And one night, sitting in my garage with nothing but a lamp and a growing sense of satisfaction, I found the line that would become my blade. Homeowners may, with appropriate notice to the board, erect temporary or permanent barriers for purposes of maintenance, security, or safety. Not common property barriers, no, but barriers on private easements. And thanks to that dusty deed, thanks to the clause Karen never thought anyone would notice, I owned that strip of pavement that ran right in front of her favorite parking spot. My easement. My rules. The next morning, I filed the notice, a simple letter. Installation of security gate across private easement. Purpose: restrict unauthorized use. I sent it certified mail, CCing the property manager and the HOA attorney. By law, they couldn't deny it. They could only review for aesthetic compliance. And by a stroke of cosmic comedy, the HOA's own design standards favored iron gates with decorative finials. Exactly what I ordered. It took 2 weeks for the crew to come out. Karen didn't suspect a thing, at least not until the posts went in. I can still see her storming down the street in her robe and slippers, hair unpinned, yelling at the contractor about illegal obstruction. He showed her the permit and shrugged. "Take it up with the board," he said. Oh, she did. She called an emergency meeting, but by then it was too late. The foundation was poured, the post set. Even the board attorney admitted on the record, this installation appears compliant with both municipal code and the HOA's governing documents. That's the kind of sentence that kills a tyrant slowly. By the time the gate swung shut for the first time, it wasn't just metal and hinges. It was leverage, a black iron reminder that the ground beneath her heels was no longer hers to command. And that's what led to this morning. Her Lexus trapped, her hands trembling against the bars, her voice trembling between rage and desperation. "You can't just block me in," she spat. "I didn't block you in," I said, my voice calm, maybe too calm. Neighbors edged closer, pretending to check mail or roll out bins. One of them, old Mr. Franklin, muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Looks fair to me." Karen spun around, pointing at him like a prosecutor. "This is harassment. This is a violation of my rights." "Your rights?" I tilted my head. Funny, Because according to the bylaws you love so much, homeowners are responsible for respecting easements. You've been parking on mine for months, without permission. That landed like a gavel strike. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She looked cornered, and maybe for the first time in years she was. But here's the thing about Karen. You never get total victory, not in one swing. She regrouped, fast. Her voice softened, too soft. Maybe we can come to some arrangement. That's when she reached into her purse, pulled out a folded envelope, and slipped it through the bars. For your trouble. I didn't even look inside. I let it fall to the asphalt. Neighbors gasped. One woman laughed. The sound cut Karen deeper than any gate could. She tried everything after that, threatening to sue, claiming selective enforcement, even calling the city inspector. But every path she took looped back to the same wall. Her own bylaws, her own minutes, her own obsession with control. She had finally met someone willing to weaponize them with sharper precision than she ever imagined. But still, as I stood there with the sun climbing higher, I couldn't shake the unease, because if there's one thing you learn about people like Karen, it's that humiliation doesn't end them. It transforms them. And humiliation in front of neighbors, that's a seed that grows into something darker. The gate creaked as it locked into place, the padlock shining in the morning light. Karen's Lexus sat silent behind it, a trophy I hadn't planned, but one I couldn't resist savoring. She stood frozen, eyes burning holes through me, and in that moment I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Because what happens when someone like Karen has nothing left to lose?